warm hello to everyone out there. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you this evening. My name is Kelly Berry. I have two roles at Hopkins. My first one encompasses a range of initiatives that support our undergraduate students who are the first in their families to attend college. But my other very exciting role is with the Common Question program, which we call by its initials CQ. When my partners and I co-created CQ a few years ago, our aim was to help students engage with a big question from multiple perspectives and outside the formality of classroom spaces. It's a framework that allows us to respond to issues that have important academic threads, but also equally important real-life impacts. As the significance of COVID-19 became clear last year, it guided us to focus on the question of what is the common good for this academic year and to shape a syllabus around it and offer that to the whole Hopkins community. And what we've discovered this year is that CQ can operate very much like a portable classroom. It's like a seminar that can be customized, made as big or as small as the participants wish. And so I thank Vicki for the invitation to share it here. We've been sharing it with students, with faculty, with alumni, and now we'd like to invite you to take it up as you wish. Before we move to our panel discussion, I want to say thank you to Vicki. Thank you to the invisible, nimble hands that are making this whole show happen. And also deep, deep thanks to my partners, Eliza Waters, Anne Elizabeth Brodsky, and Hannah Shea, ladies in arms, partners in crime, everything to do with Common Question. Okay, so our discussion in the first half of the hour is going to be among some Hopkins alums. Our panelists this evening, I'm also fortunate to know as a result of connections that Hopkins has made for me over many years at different points in my life and from different roles that I've occupied. Jean McGarry is a writer and a teacher of writing. She's been faculty in the writing seminars for over 30 years. We met many years ago in the work of caregiving, far afield from our professional lives, and I'm happy that Hopkins has kept us in each other's orbits. I'm also connected to Jean as a reader of her novels and her short stories. Zane Forshee is a guitarist. He has many roles at Peabody, on the guitar faculty in the conservatory, as chair of guitar in the preparatory, and as director of a new initiative that helps students in their creative and professional wayfinding. I met Zane as part of a family commitment to learning classical guitar. So my husband, my son, and I have all been his students. And so I can comfortably say that Zane is a gifted teacher. Okay, Molly Cueva-Dubkowski studied public health and sociology. I met Molly when she was finishing up her undergraduate work at Hopkins, and she was focusing at the time on Latin America and on poverty as a multidimensional phenomenon. Molly, I would say, is equal parts activist, scholar, and writer. She's wrapping up a role at the American Civil Liberties Union and heading to law school soon. So Jean and Zane and Molly are going to offer some comments about how they view the common good from their own perspective. And Jean, I'll ask you to go first.
Thank you, Kelly. Well, I don't think either one of us will ever forget our caregiving opportunity, which was an amazing experience. I have written down my remarks, so if I'm looking to the side, I'm just reading from my phone. When I think of literature, it does seem an entirely good thing, but perhaps more aimed at the individual good. But that in turn is good for the commonality, as those individuals who read or write fiction tend to have as acute an understanding of other humans as do psychologists, and sometimes they're even a few steps ahead. So the individual good affects family, friends, and advances outward. The 19th century Russian writer Anton Chekhov is one of my favorites. I've taught his stories so often, I sometimes feel I might have written one of them. They're that close to my own inner life. But what I think is his key virtue as an artist is his handling of adversity. Poverty, brutality, isolation, alienation, failure, disillusionment, conditions and problems suffered in mostly rural and backward Russia. You name the adversity, he's written a story about a character who is enmeshed in this kind of personal, financial, familial, or societal trouble. Toward the end of his life, adversity in his stories increases and deepens. We've had a year of terrible trouble in this country, but I haven't heard a single word about enduring this adversity that would interest and impress Chekhov. So I ask myself, what would that Chekhovian take be? Not what we hear in the media, that adversity isn't exceptional in life, that it can be avoided or overcome if we do the right thing or ask for help, but that adversity is inevitable. In Chekhov's stories, adversity offers his characters the opportunity to embody and to enact stoicism, courage, empathy, thoughtfulness, or to crumble in fear, despair, rash action, self-destruction. Instead of this large view on adversity, what we've been served up in the media and government concerns only self-protection, along with sensational accounts of the numbers of deaths. Of course, in the heroism of nurses, doctors, EMT workers, grocery clerks. Sometimes a big chunk of human wisdom seems missing from the reportage and punditry about the year-long advance of this highly infectious and deadly virus. In his last years of his life, exiled in the mild climate of Yalta and suffering from end-stage tuberculosis, Chekhov, a doctor, involved himself in the disease catastrophe of his time, cholera. He treated hundreds of patients, most of them unable to pay. He was always one to extend himself, and somehow, although he died at 41, was able to write 600 stories and a number of plays. The disaster that was cholera wasn't seen in his letters and stories as the end of the world. It was not seen as it was seen as a struggle and opportunity to contribute to the common good. And as always, he answered to the call. But it's mostly in his stories that I see something of infinite value to the reader, an ability to situate adversity in a wholly human context. His characters bear up under their sufferings or they don't. But mostly the Chekhovian philosophy embedded in all of his work is a close-up study of characters in adversity and the choices they make. And he applies a surgical eye to those choices and what they say about character. Is that person prompted to altruism or selfishness, energy or inertia, hope or despair? The stories are not just a tonic, but a kind of purge that eliminates sentimentality and short-term thinking with something that someone in adversity can really hold on to. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. I'm going to spend a lot of hours at some other time trying to imagine how I could impress Chekhov. It's a metric I hadn't thought of to evaluate the past year. Zane, I invite you, please.
First of all, I just want to say, wow. And, you know, as I thought a lot about this, and I spent some time in the past couple weeks going through the CQ website and just doing a lot of listening and reading and thinking about some of the things that were posted there, and I thought about my own work that I've done as a performer and my own work that I've done as a teacher, and in both of these things there's a commonality, and the work that performing artists do, and I'm talking strictly from my perspective right now as a guitarist that functions as a soloist, a chamber musician and as a teacher, the one link between both of those is that for centuries they were done in spaces with people, and that connective fiber of being in a room with lots of strangers, and then there's a moment where everyone kind of connects. There's this moment where when you spend all of your time traveling and practicing, the payoff is that moment when you are in with a room full of strangers and you connect. And you have that similar experience on a weekly level as a teacher, and in a lot of the work, at least from my perspective, because much of the work is done one-to-one or in small groups. And with the onset of COVID pulling away that possibility of being in a shared space, creating a communal event, it was interesting to watch how so many of my friends, colleagues, and loved ones turned to the arts in other ways to find a sense of connection. And as I thought about that more, I really started to realize we were alone together, and that the arts piece of this, the whatever form you were engaging in, was a connection. And that led me to this thinking about this concept that the musician and sound artist Brian Eno came up with called a scenius, which is the concept he developed that removes the idea of the lone genius artist and is talking about the idea of how every artist and every person that comes up with creative thought, and I love that it's creative thought, that there are no categories, but that we're all creative, and that you actually live in an ecosystem of thoughts and ideas, and that your scenius is built from the people you engage with on a regular basis. I will try and find this and plop it in the chat. There's this wonderful picture of Beethoven's head and then all these people around him, because it wasn't like he just kind of woke up with these ideas. They emerged in his community. And again, that connection to others being a big part of this. At the same time, one of the best things about the arts and some of the most creative work in the arts comes under the challenge of constraint. And I was on a call with a friend on Zoom, except in this case we were 2 squares instead of multiple squares. And he asked me, what are you excited about in this? And I said, I want to see what we're all going to start to come up with now once we calm down. What are we going to do? How are we going to imagine community? How are we going to deal with these constraints in creative ways? Where does the imagination kick on and the innovation? And so while it's been an incredibly painful year for all of us in many ways, it's been an exciting challenge to look at these constraints as a way of seeing what's possible and how we'll reimagine things. And that is something that I'm thinking about with the arts and this topic.
Thank you so much, Zane. Zane made reference to the Common Question website, and I'd ask if one of my CQ colleagues could put that link in the chat. All right, Molly, we're on to you.
Well, thank you all for the introduction and just the thoughts. I was frantically scribbling down my thoughts as I think, Jean, you've blown us all out of the water. So I like to introduce myself as a Californian Ecuadorian from San Francisco. And I do that kind of whenever I introduce myself as a way of positioning how I'm very interested in in-betweenness. So I was born in Ecuador and raised in San Francisco. And early on, I started to think a lot about space and deservedness, because San Francisco is a very small place and because it is a very expensive place. And so before I came to Hopkins, I was a 2017 grad of the Krieger School. I was really interested in thinking about who deserves to be in San Francisco, as so many people were being kicked out. So many people were facing staggering rents, many of whom were in my community. They were my art teachers, they were my family members, they were my friends. And I think that interest in space and who deserves to be in a space has continued to be a question that I've taken me from Hopkins, from San Francisco to now at the ACLU, where, you know, you can think about space materially. You can think about how tenants are, you know, in this year being evicted at a rapid rate across the country, and who deserves to be in their homes. But also within the institution, which I think is another kind of takeaway from this past year, who deserves to be within an institution? Who creates the institutions that we find ourselves in? You know, I think of the legal institution as one that I've committed myself to. I'm heading to law school in the fall, and it's been almost 4 years since graduating from Hopkins, because I really had to think, do I want to be part of this institution, this larger legal institution? A lot of the time that I spent at Hopkins and in San Francisco was shaking my fist at how institutions did not include people as they should, right? An institution is functional and inclusive when it's not just inviting people, but it's creating the conditions for everyone's ability to survive and thrive within them. And I say that to say that I think in thinking about the common good, thinking about the legal field, thinking about advocacy and activism, you know, when we think about the common good, I think of two things. I think one, sharing of resources, right? So I studied public health and sociology, and I'm interested in how to make, you know, knowledge about social justice not just exist within the ivory tower, but also how do we make it accessible to people? So that was an interest there, right? And then I think on the flip side of that is the common good is also the momentum of the collectivity. And I think of that within the institution. So in thinking about becoming a lawyer, how do we actually, as lawyers, I guess I'm a would-be almost give me 3 years lawyer, how do we work with advocates and organizers outside of the institution so we can make it accessible to all? How can we kind of decentralize the lawyer as the way that we make change, right? We've seen that in COVID. We've seen how protest around the George Floyd killing, and we've seen how protest around essential workers and their treatment has really centered conversations of, well, do institutions mean anything? Do they help us? Do they hurt us? And so I think in thinking about the common good, the common question here, it's thinking about that. How do we share resources? And then also, how do we kind of question the institutions that make us question the momentum of collectivity? And happy to talk about that a little bit more, but those are kind of my initial ruminations.
Thank you so much, Molly. So for everyone, we're going to spend a little bit of time here letting the panelists now speak with each other, develop the conversation a bit, and then we will shift to an opportunity for all of us to move into breakout rooms and continue that conversation and tailor it in ways that are of interest to you. So I certainly heard a thread through the three sets of comments there that sketched out a tension between individual limits, agency, constraint, however you might describe that one side of it, and on the other hand, the collective, a world of connections, of institutional frameworks, an ecosystem. And you can explore that tension from a creative point of view, with a political charge, from an ethical point of view. So I would just offer that reflection back to Zane and Jean and Molly and see if anybody wants to tug on that thread or pick up another element to unpack a little bit with each other.
Any takers so far? I wanted to, one thing that really resonated for me with both of these was, and particularly with Molly's comment around who gets to be in a place, and one of the things I've thought a lot about, and again, this is from the lens of an artist, is that, you know, art can also be a piece that is about access at times. And when I'm looking at that and seeing the impact that as a tool for expression, as a tool for idea generation, and as a tool in terms of building community, I don't always feel that it is accessible. And it is something that, as a constraint, I think, what are the barriers? Why are there barriers? How could we remove those barriers? And it's something that I don't have the answer to. And it is something that I know is, whenever there are constraints of budget, it is the first piece to go. And it is also, yet, I think, one of the things during this time of challenge, and I'm thinking of common good, it is one of the first places that we turn to for solace and comfort.
Something, Zane, that you said, just to kind of hop in here, of this, Brian knows the Xenius. Is it Xenius? Xenius?
I don't think there's it's never, I've never heard anyone say it except me. So any pronunciation is good with me.
I had that moment many times at Hopkins where it's like, I've only ever read this word in my head, so I'm just going to go out on a limb here and hope that no one in the seminar giggles. Yeah, I mean, I think, so something that you said, in combination with something you said, Zane, and what you said, Kelly, was this idea of institutional frameworks. And I guess I kind of think of, within this COVID context that we find ourselves, because I think it's hard to kind of talk about these questions without the framework of COVID, is, you know, what purpose does the institution serve? I think this year we saw so often how institutions were not able to provide the needs that people had. So I think of, in Brooklyn, you know, I was in Brooklyn for most of the pandemic, or for the beginnings of it. And it was when New York was the epicenter of the pandemic, and no one knew what was going on. And it was really scary. There were sounds of alarms on at every hour of the night. But the beauty that kind of cropped up from that were all of these mutual aid groups in all over Brooklyn, all over New York, and all of the boroughs, as these kind of decentralized conglomerations of people who were bringing food to elders in the neighborhood, who were bringing medicine, who were bringing, I mean, there were beautiful requests to like bring CDs to be, you know, older folks who didn't have like access to the internet in their apartments. And that was not within an institutional context. Maybe it was within an institutional framework. But when I think of the Xenius also, right, like, where is the beauty in the collaboration? Where is the beauty when these mutual aid organizations crop up in the context of music, right? I don't know what that kind of looks like. And I'm curious, Zane, what that kind of looks like from your framework. But if we can collaborate and share food and shelter, how can we collaborate with sound in a way that is more almost like post-institutionally?
Well, you know, it's interesting the way Marin Alsop with the Baltimore Symphony has included so much programming that has to do with talking about the music, you know, and kind of mediating between the pure sound and what people might be thinking when they're listening, what the composer might have been thinking about, all of that. I think music is, and perhaps true of visual art too. I think it's great that there's some kind of mediation where, you know, the person is connected to the production. I also was wondering, I wanted to ask Kelly, what did the students come up with over time with what the common good is? Do they have interesting ideas about what that concept might be?
I'm not deflecting your question, Jean, but I want to send it to a richer response. So Eliza, I'm going to call you to join the conversation, if you wouldn't mind, and Anne Elizabeth. Eliza has taught a first-year seminar in the fall and now again in the spring on the common good, and has been in really close ongoing conversation with students who've just arrived at Hopkins about that. So go ahead, Eliza.
Absolutely. Hello. This was wonderful. I'm very, very briefly, I will say that my students this year have probably with any large question had to undergo the process of having a first blush response of saying something like, the common good is that which maximizes benefit to the most. And then they're like, that's day one. where do we go from here beyond a basic utilitarian framework? And so the pleasure of CQ, the pedagogical pleasure, but also the emotional pleasure has been watching them read Jhumpa Lahiri short stories about the common good as defined in marriage, to read the Pope's encyclical on our common world, and think about the environment, to read Alec McGillis on public transportation in Baltimore. And so to kind of reconstitute over and over again a new understanding. So it's not something that gets, I guess by the end of the semester, what they've realized is that they don't have a more definitive answer. They just have a wider lens. And may we all want that for our students, but that's been something that's really a pleasure to watch them have to reckon with.
Do you think that amounts to illustrations of common good? I mean, is that what is evoked from the reading? Examples?
Yeah, so I think it's a tension between, sometimes it's it's examples and manifestations of that serve as examples, and then it's also theories or frameworks for thinking about. And so how they can go between their abstract conceptualizations about that and then the examples of, and kind of hold them both.
And I'll just add to that, just to your question, Jean, one of the sources is the story of Noah, which appears in the Torah and the Bible and the Quran. And it's not clear if we read this as a story, like, was this for the common good? It was, it was genocide, right? So there's argument. So not all, I wouldn't say that the sources are necessarily illustrative of an answer. Sometimes they're illustrative of the question again in a new way. And my experience is quite different from Eliza's in that my conversations with students about the common good have been these, just one conversation with a group of students who don't necessarily know each other about one source for an hour. And it's meant to be just as informal, as Kelly said at the beginning, sort of a traveling classroom that's outside a graded space. And our focus has been intensely around what it means to get into an elite university and what's the process by which that happened. What's they're very clear on the myth of meritocracy, but they're not clear on what, and I'm not either, about what if anything, should they have done differently, or what are they supposed to do now that they're going to have this like very fancy bachelor's degree, and those are really hard questions, and intense, and so that's been very focused. And I didn't get to see the evolution that Eliza sees over the course of the semester, but it was like very affecting for me, to talk to them about that.
I'm going to jump in. I didn't have my eye on the chat. I apologize. Henry Wasserman, you have a question, and I'd ask if you want to unmute yourself and pose it to Molly.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I was born and raised in Latin America like Molly Cueva, except that I lived on and off mainly for training in medicine and public health in the United States, where I also worked in the state of Maryland as an epidemiologist. And then after briefly living in Florida, I moved back to my home country where I worked and where I recently retired from the Ministry of Health. And I'm very concerned about the lack of interest in global health in this country, where there's a deficit of vaccines worldwide, and it seems we're just concerned here about getting our own vaccines here in this country. I mean, I'm lucky that I'm here now and that I've been vaccinated, but what about low and middle income countries all throughout the world? You know? That's all.
Yes, I mean a resounding yes. I think that's if we think about I think I'm chewing on this post-institutional framework because we're seeing such a clear moment where institutions are failing us, right? We're seeing how vaccines are being withheld from countries across the world outside of kind of the Western sphere. I think of my own family. So I've been looking at a summer of being vaccinated and going on, you know, a road trip across the country safely with a mask. And, you know, obviously I'm listening to the public health major within, but I think of my family who, you know, they're under martial law right now, locked in their houses in Quito, which has been the capital, which has been hit a lot less hard than Guayaquil, which you mentioned in your comment. I mean, I think empathy, I watched a TED Talk maybe 5-10 years ago that was talking about empathy stopping at our own national borders, right? That empathy so often extends as far as we can kind of conceive of our world, and beyond that, it just fades. And I think we see that today, that we, you know, we are so focused on ourselves within this institution of the United States, right? It is this large institution we find ourselves in. So, I mean, I don't have a solution there. I think it would take institutional leveraging, but also wouldn't it take empathy extending beyond our national borders? And what does that really get at? That gets at larger systems of political inequality, larger, you know, seated hatred that we find that colonialism and imperialism have gifted us. So a resounding yes. And also, you know, how do we move beyond this? I'd be curious to hear Jean and Zane's thoughts here.
Well, I think what needs to be done, and I am a U.S. citizen as well, because in my country you can hold dual citizenship. I think we have to move beyond the political in dealing with this pandemic, and as was mentioned by the party in power now, but really stick to the science and not the political. And that holds not only in this country, but in my country and in many, many countries across the world, where partisan divides have interrupted the effective management of the pandemic. And I don't think that's one party or the other in this country. I don't know about your country, but I think we can see that we have elections in Costa Rica next year. And because of partisanship and political interests, people are getting infected. There's not enough beds anymore. There's no more beds in the ICUs. There's not enough vaccines. So, I mean, it's like what happened in Europe at the beginning of the pandemic. And unfortunately, I don't think in this country that it has to do with being Republican or Democrat. I think it has to do with really being concerned about other people and not about your own pocket, you know?
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question that's come in through the chat. And then check in, after that, I'm going to check in with Vicki about whether we want to move to breakout rooms, because the conversation starts to spread and you might want to take it into other places. In quick response to some of what just was talked through, I know that in some of the conversations that I have with friends who are artists and mathematicians, both of them have pointed to what are to them very palpable connections between constraints on our ability to think with imagination, which would lead to greater empathy, which would lead to a broader perspective and a focus on the essential interconnectedness of things, which in the end helps with the logistics of, oh boy, we need to help India if we're going to help us, right? So, you know, and an investment in thinking creatively and with imagination is very important for nourishing and addressing issues bound up with the common good. And the other one is an investment in learning how to think with abstraction, because risk management depends so much on the ability to think abstractly, and the inability to perceive and manage risk has to do with true concrete and immediate, you know, kind of a foreclosed perspective. So as much as I appreciate public health being paramount here, it is it's complementary to other modes of thinking and the education that support them that matter most. Okay, Charlene, I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask your question to everyone, I guess, or just put it out there.
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name is Charlene, and I'm in the state of Maine, and I've been teaching high school math for 31 years. And thanks to Hopkins, in the past 4 years, I've also been teaching an introductory neuroscience class to seniors at an independent day school. It's pre-K through 12, and it's a private school, and I'm really uncomfortable, even though I love my school, I love my students, I love what I do, but we have been face to face since September, and there's a part of me, and it's been horrendously challenging, marvelous in so many ways, but so challenging, and I'm, thank you, and I'm concerned about the fact that I'm actually uncomfortable with the fact that my students have a huge advantage compared to their public peers who were remote, like almost the whole time. And I'm curious, like how to, I don't know, I guess how to make that, how to settle that in my own soul. If when we're talking about, especially when we talk about arts. I mean, I know that I teach math and neuroscience, but I teach it through crafts. As you can tell behind me, this is a craft room. And I love to teach math and neuroscience through crafts, through arts and crafts, and just really exploring everything through creativity. And that was the one part that was actually absent, or it was very hard to do when we were 6 feet apart and we couldn't share supplies and all that kind of stuff. So there, I guess there's a two-part question there as to what you guys, how do I just kind of embrace the privilege that my students had compared to their public school peers.
Thank you, Charlene. I know it certainly resonates with me. I've had a child who's not been in person since last March, and I'm going to guess there are other parents and grandparents out there who are up close with that issue as well. Vicki has set up some breakout rooms, and I'm going to hand it over to her to direct us in there, where we can dig into Charlene's question and other questions in a way where we get a little more traction in the time that's remaining. Vicki?
I hope that the time went quickly, and that's always a good sign. And you had some nice conversation. So, you know, I just wanted to say a few words of thanks to everyone for coming and joining us today. The CQ team is going to be delighted to know that I'm spotlighting them again here so that you can really remember who it is who brought this conversation to you. And I'm looking for all our panelists, and this is where multitasking is not a great thing. But if anyone would like to share some final words from our panelists or highlight something that came up in the breakouts for all of us to hear, I invite you to do so. We have about 4 minutes. Just please unmute and jump in. Otherwise, oh, Jane.
Okay, well, we had in the last minute, we had this really interesting point come up about we got into a Molly, what was we were talking about a framework, the
Post-institutional frameworks.
right, which led to a conversation about an a website developed by a college student that was aggregating where all the vaccines were in the state of Maryland, which got into a TikTok musical. And I think the thing that really struck me about that was that to kind of go back to the constraint piece, when we've all been forced into an impossible situation that we're all having to adapt in, there are no more rules. So then everything becomes like an amateur's approach to something. Like, you know, it's like me when I started cooking through this whole thing. I was just going for it because I had no framework. And then I started to realize, hey, there are cooking books, and you hold the knife this way, or house repairs. This is, and not to make light of this, but in a sense, like there's a freedom in not having that rigidity of structure, and that's where that innovation piece can emerge. And I think that's something that folks that are put in challenging constraints, when given themselves permission, can really develop some amazing outcomes and things that surprise everyone.
And how can solitude help that, right? This past year, I was alone in my Brooklyn apartment for at least 4 months. And there was this piano, and I'm looking at all of your instruments, Zane. There was a piano in our living room, and I never touched it because I've never been trained to play piano. And I sat down on Easter, and I had a solo Easter concert with myself, and perhaps to my neighbor's chagrin, but I thought it was quite lovely. And I felt deep, deep compassion for myself in that moment, that I'm learning, that I'm figuring this out. And I sent the recording to several friends who were supportive, though, you know, a bit dubious about my practicing. But how can solitude allow us to? There is power in the collective, but there is also power in the individual on their own existing, in their own, you know, individual power, and they can bring that back to the collective.
I'll jump in just to say thank you to everyone. We are coming up on the hour. Thanks again to Vicki, to you and your team for organizing this. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Zane. Thank you, Molly. Thanks to the CQ team. Thanks to everybody who was here and joined the conversation.
Yes, thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoy your evening, and I hope to see you at more Alumni Weekend events this weekend. And I think your point to ponder is whether TikTok is, in fact, for the common good. Discuss. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.